Thank you so much, Hassan. I will always be grateful for Susie and Larry in a way because of the relationship we've been able to have because of that. So thank you so much. That was perfect. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much to both Hassan and Christine, both the summer program and the arts initiative for having me, and also Frank for helping. This wouldn't have happened without him at all. I cannot express the significance of this experience for me. I have really loved so much being here and working with the students and being able to make art in this particular environment. I also know that I am not an easy guest to have, and I'll maybe talk about that a little bit later, but that does make me even more grateful that this was made possible. There's a lot that had to go into it, so thank you. And I did want to start by talking about water. I have some images which were taken while I have been here the last 2 weeks, thinking about water and water drops dripping and about drying. And I'm going to play a couple of those real quick. Wet things are important to me. I've been thinking about them since I did my BFA thesis, which was quite a while ago. For my thesis project, I was thinking a lot about wet paint. I made paintings using icy hot ointment instead of paint because the ointment does not dry, and it also produces a strong smell that clears your sinuses. It is both acrid and refreshing at the same time, and can be kind of overwhelming and unpleasant, but also kind of gratifying. I projected a PowerPoint onto the painted wall, which allowed the icy hot to slowly melt in the heat and allowed me to work with language. I wanted to use PowerPoint for a really stupid reason, simply because it is called PowerPoint, which I thought was really interesting. And I also liked and still like that it is so flattening. You can make the text feel very flat as an image, but also when you animate it at a uniform speed, there's a kind of reading and rhythm that happens, but also a sort of an unreading and defamiliarizing effect that it has on the language. And I really appreciate and love that about PowerPoint. In the adjacent gallery, I had this is actually sunscreen that was painted on the window. It's not the best image with a grid, but the gallery was humidified with swimming pool water. And the statement, "There is no swimming pool," was written on the wall. I don't want to get too deeply into the narrative of this or the other pieces that were included in this project, but only to say that this is where I started to try to open up the moment of painting for the viewer, so that they were not merely having contact with a dried product, but with something that was still wet. For me, my work has always been a question without an answer, which is why it continues to feel wet, and I am very rarely ready for it to dry. While working on this project, I started to think about how painting, if it were a graph, would be like intimacy. It's a kind of asymptote that gets closer and closer, but never arriving. The painting was interceding in this relationship between a painter and a viewer, between the painter and the experiences of painting, and always approaching but never arriving. My relationship to my own body has had this same feeling. I cannot tell if something was perpetually receding or if it was approaching. And I wanted to stay inside the moment of wet paint where things were still immediate. What was clear was that even as I felt immediacy, intimacy, integration into the environment, felt that the painting was gesturing towards closeness, the separation between the painting, the painter, and the viewer remained firm. After I finished my BFA, I left school, and I was feeling very lonely and disconnected, which I think happens leaving college. It was sometime shortly thereafter that I was watching a video of Catherine Malibu lecturing. She is a French philosopher who I love, who she seems to me to bridge some of the gaps between analytic and continental philosophy. I had become increasingly interested in her conceptual use of the term plasticity, which she defined as something flexible and transformable, but with points of resistance. She described it as a thing that could be expunged, but could not be fully, something that could be expunged but could not be fully assimilated. It was something that allowed her to deconstruct ideas while still having some stability or allowing some things to instantiate. I still remember this moment, even though it was before I met Hassan, so it was a long time ago. I watched her lecture one night. Her talk was called, "Can We Relinquish the Transcendental?" She sat at a table with her notes surrounded by water vessels. A water glass to her left was filled with water. There was a sparkling clear pitcher that also sat on the table that was almost completely full. Her hand continuously passed behind the lens of the water glass as she lectured. You could see the water glass transforming the shape and direction of her fingers, reversing the image of her hand. She didn't touch or drink from the glass. This was withheld. The temporality, her apparent need for water at some future moment, and the reflection of the light off of the painted wall behind her, all of this left me feeling totally transfixed. I was suspended in a very long moment, waiting for her to drink and listening to her ask if we can relinquish the transcendental. She was specifically talking about continental philosophy and its contemporary relationship to Kant. In her lectures, she later modifies this question, asking about risk and if it is possible for a gentle rupture, a farewell that does not risk all of continental philosophy in the process. I think some level of risk is important in my practice, in all of the practices that I engage in, but not because the result is an inevitable march toward an endless deconstructive place, but because risk and frustration are for me some of the most potent stabilizers. These moments are also where things shift. You cannot stay suspended in them forever, but this most unctuous and fraught bit of the process to make art, I learn again and again to love and find it to be a way through. I immediately felt that I needed to make something that would allow me to get closer to the moment with her water glass. I started painting it, working on a PowerPoint, and attempting to measure the distance between her hand and the glass in an animation. I thought about green screen painting and also rotoscoping. Ultimately, I felt I would not be able to make a work about it because the work had already been made. It was the space between us, which was very real and also part of an image world. The dry digital space of YouTube where my intense loneliness was met with the question I had continually been asking myself, inside the voice, the body, and the very livingness of this other person, whose erudition and European context was entirely different from my own. Asking an object or a sculpture to perform non-dualism sometimes seems like kind of asking a lot. Asking it to be both or all things, to recede even as it comes forward, to be perceived, and to withdraw in incompleteness. But on the other hand, which is kind of a pun, you really have to intercede very little, if at all, because it is, of course, already doing all of these things already all the time. I still feel a huge sense of ambiguity inside of this project, which is where the action comes in. I do not seem to be able to rid myself of attachments without some sort of active process. And even then, it is not as if they fall away, it is that they intensify. And until finally I exhaust myself enough that I am able to momentarily give them up. I think that is what remains the appeal of this moment for me. Catherine Malibu lectures about relinquishing the transcendental, and as she does, so her water glass sits quietly untouched. The image of her hand passing through its clear, watery being, and I waited, and still wait, for the moment when she would touch the water. The contact through YouTube, the realization that image, screen, water glass, and philosopher were all materially real, and that I was also somehow both occupying the same reality and unalterably not occupying that reality at all. I could go to Switzerland, read and drink every word, every bit of her water, learn French and translate her work, read everything in the archives at Brown that she's ever written, sit in the room with the light and the mountain air and the pure erudition of that context. I could both want to touch her hand and to be her hand. The self is not what resolves this endless deconstruction. It is change. Plasticity tells us that transformation can be a kind of refuge or a form of presence. Ultimately, my own thirst could not touch hers. I was talking to Justin, who is here and who is teaching the summer program seminar called What is Truth? And he was telling me about an axiom: you cannot eat for another person. I think that this is the distance between people that my work is consistently looking for ways to articulate and submit to. I feel like this experience needs to, in some way, be made more acute for me, because without actively engaging it, I think there's a risk associated with it that the desire to cross this distance will subsume me. Its acknowledgement perversely opens up the space to submit to and accept this condition, which is something I require to move forward. And the significance of these encounters with images online has only become more tied for me to survival and embodiment. The materiality of these images and the very real consequences that they can have is what my practice allows me to take more time with. So this is an image from the DRBU fountain with a hand, which made me think a lot about Catherine Malbu and the water glass again. And this is an image from the cafeteria of one of the water glasses here. Okay. So the next work that I made, well, not the next work that I made, but a related work, I made about internet and water while living in the desert in Arizona and watching the Swiss snow in the mountains on a live feed camera. It starts with the sound of me running on a treadmill, so you'll hear that immediately, just so you know. And you'll see the interior of my water bottle. This is just a trailer for the whole piece, which was exhibited only online, but I am going to play some of that. Hopefully, let me check the sound really quick here. Actually, okay.
The acts of ghosts are acts of being without isness. Or in more crucial language, the biological histories of those animals who miss the temperature of the water, who first shed their primordial natures out of the uncodified blankness of vital structure, and were stuck with particulate matter which both dries cracked and already is a partially congealed second layer of mud. Animals who knelt on sand and felt weight, which was itself a surprise. These animals opened an animal for whom clean here means more cold and closeness and maybe even visibility and the idea of water, than something with causation. And who experienced this first instant of surface, which was understood also as the first phenomenon of dirt. They are excessively secluded now. Fossil records do not compare to the surface of air, cleared by the cold that was distinct with them. And when asked to celebrate time, to commodify, to think about their own birthdays, they were already heedlessly gone. This is familiar. Broad worminess. The idea of soap is gone. The body to be cleaned does not exist. It's a materialism about visible contactable points. But the state of surveillance has ended. What follows is unbound from completeness. Where does your object being withdraw from its wetness? And your object isness from its relation? Triple-blinded observations of effective observable responses and unuttered predicates on closed-circuit cameras strained on the digital withdraw dryly from your soft, snaky unwaterness. Is this the very threat of wetness? I am depleted in fear at the thought of its disappearance. Back behind the white crisp shell of the egg, the threat of wetness is ruinous to us. The egg glopping open. But inside the egg things are already wet and spongy. And dry on their very insides. But then there is more wetness. Wetness and dryness, in surface tandem. Bringing your face to it. Do you touch dryness now? There it's wet. Swallows more. I have dreams where you speak, not of the supersensible, but you talk about desire and the room nods, like everyone is at a table or crowded in a doorway. This ghost that exists and then disappears is a more difficult animal for me than a non-existent one could have been. Like you, it seems to be the arbiter of its own physicality. I write to you now the first time. And the last time. Because my limbic system is taut. The mammalian aquatic response is the standard relation of things. But I am not stretchy enough. And not water wet enough. I am left with a non-standard response and do not want to remind you that we agree to touch the weird primal reptilian brained feeling.
I'm not entirely sure how I feel about this piece now, but I did really want the water. I was interested in having the snake drinking in the water glass with this setup and seeing how that felt. So I appreciate you for indulging that. Okay, let's see. So next I want to talk about food. Food was the last part of the talk that I wrote, and to be honest, and still in many ways I really haven't written it yet. I think food has been something that my work has been on the edge of thinking about for a while, and especially in the past year, but it takes me a really long time to understand what's going on. I've been really interested in the grocery store for a long time and what testing artworks in that space does. I've also thought a lot about this cheese coupon for the past 15 years, which is something that I have a really intimate relationship with, but it's also something that's very cold. Our food space is where we make many of our ultimate concessions to violence. Vegan or not, we are participants in a very intimate and bodily way in systems that are well outside of our awareness, let alone control. This cheese coupon has been really important for me over the past 15 years or so, because it is one of the first things that taught me about breaking an advertisement by interpreting it as totally sincere, thus submitting to it and forcing it into a different position, making it occupy what it pretends to occupy anyway. I think about intimacy and the immediacy of this image on the back, which could have easily been an image of me as a child, just as easily as it is something on the back of a coupon. The edges were determined in a totally arbitrary way, seemingly arbitrary, maybe I should say, because the coupon was cut out, and that's where the image, that's what determined what the image shows. This is the thing about images that's really interesting to me, or one of the many things that's interesting to me, is that they can break open when you believe in them, almost more so than when you don't. I think there is a choice involved, and acknowledge that it's a very individual process and it might be totally different for others. But for me, I cannot come to the middle without first passing through. And avoidance has largely and usually not helped me to break the images that have power over me. But this cheese coupon has helped me quite a bit. I want to talk a little bit about Silvio Berlusconi and some work that I made directed at him. He was, for those of you who don't know, a 3-time elected prime minister in Italy who moved from television to politics and predates our own American example of this phenomenon. I have found that I must actively do something in order to accept the political conditions that we live in, but my sphere of influence is very small. The acceptance and submission do not come to me passively or naturally, so I started collecting things. I started collecting cherry gummy candies from packages of fruit snacks, and plastic fish, and plastic goats, and plastic lambs, and all kinds of other objects. Have a lot of objects still for him, even though he died last year. And I started making these pieces. These pieces are directed usually at a specific article. So this one was about this Easter lamb article, and the lambs are covered in this ultra numbing cream, which kind of is a bit protective. It's kind of a very classic dictator with a kitten kind of image. And then this one is about the Putin Berlusconi friendship, and has kind of like a sequence to it, which is how they sort of started to unfold more, was with this kind of sequencing. Started becoming a little bit more of like a sentence of some sort, but all of them thinking about the image of Silvio Berlusconi, but not really being about him, but really for years of my life, I conceived of myself as making art for him, even though we really didn't have a whole lot of contact. So I am going to show just a little bit of this video, which was also made directed toward him, and has some, just going to show a few seconds of it, but it has some images of paintings that he's interacting with, which I think are really interesting.
It is in the interest of the same voyeurism shared by sunlight and beach tables that I ask you to progress further into solidness. It's squishy, the pleasure situation we are in. I am thinking of hard effervescence and everything being so balmy in Italy. The idea is to dip it in neutral medium, snow melt, almond granita, airport milk, diatomaceous earth, and somehow here.
So this is kind of how it continues, and there's a whole series, many series of videos directed toward him, thinking about these images, which there are a lot of images of him that are really interesting that if you're interested, you can look into. There's one of him with Gaddafi that's really great. But he died, and that was really difficult for me when that happened. He died, I mean that very sincerely, unfortunately, but he died last year, and I made this final piece called Asking a Ladder to Kneel about that after he died, and it felt really different making this work. It was a drastically different process because I knew that he wasn't on the other end. And I mean that really seriously. I think it's weird that I feel this way, but I do. I think that this project has really been about trying to have some kind of empathy for him, which is maybe not super helpful in a bigger sense, but it was really helpful for me on a personal level. I started thinking a lot about the body with like a more Christian orientation toward eating and food, and kind of this like human sacrifice cannibalism in Christianity. And everything that I think was happening with the Silvio Project really mirrored a lot of the relationships I had with some Mormon patriarchal kind of figures growing up in Utah. And so I think that's why this work was really important for me to make, even though it was kind of a strange choice of project. Let's see. I don't know if I can even show this, but that's okay. This is a video that was projected underneath. Not sure why it's not playing, but that's all right. Anyway, continuing with food. This was a piece that I made last winter, and I was thinking about it partly because it's the image on the cover of the talk, even though I don't love this piece. I think it's kind of unresolved, but also because I was talking to Megan when I first arrived here, who is not here this week, but is a member of the DRBU community and director of the university relations. And I was talking to her about her PhD dissertation. And I was asking her some questions because I made this work last winter while I was reading The Phenomenology of Perception by Merleau-Ponty in a reading group. And I was thinking about the strange examples that he uses in that book. She was explaining to me that he locates the paradox between your experience of yourself as a subject and the experience of yourself as an object in the world, in the body. And I can really see the value of this, and I understand why she's using him in her PhD. This is definitely, I fully understand that, but I still wonder about these examples. I don't think a body can be an example, and I don't think an artwork can be an example either. I think these things have to retain their complete uniqueness. And I was thinking also, while making this work, about some of the disabled kids I used to work with in functional skills who would use their bodies and language in totally unique ways that did not need to be pathologized in any way. And in some way, I kind of felt affirmatively really rejected that kind of a reading. The experience of your body as an object and subject might be different, but these two could also be things that are both happening in some bigger container. So ultimately, the difference between these two experiences is always at stake and an open question, but I think there's a way to think about them as being, at the very least, simultaneous, which kind of brings me to thinking about Buddhism with this work, which is something that I was introduced to at the same age as many of the campers who are here. I was 16, and I've kept it at arm's length in some ways since then. I feel very strongly that its significance is real, and I imagine it to be so transformative that there can be no return. I feel totally unprepared for that, and I think I also feel in some ways unprepared for the body and this idea of being a object versus being a subject. I wonder what it would be like to feel fully flush inside of your body, and if the body would then disappear. And I'm still looking for places to accept embodiment as it continues to arise, and I think that's part of what was happening with this work. It's kind of hard to tell from the pictures what's going on, but there are there's a dividing line between two sides of the room. On one side there's some wet things, and on the other there's dry things. And the whipped meringue from the eggs, dried fruit peel, clear plastic images of food and containers. And I also made a bunch of these clear molds from fruits with images kind of floating in them. And then there's this kind of fuse made out of Mr. Clean drops from Mr. Clean cloths that I cut individually the image of drops out of to make a water fuse, which was able to carry water between those two parts of the work, the dry and the wet. I'm not sure about this work, but I do think that it is a good example of looking for a body through art, and specifically looking for a body that no one owns or no one takes ownership over, which is really interesting to me. Continuing on with food, thinking a lot about eggs. For the last 6 months or so, I've been anticipating coming here. And a few years ago now, I developed a stack of different inflammatory conditions and subsequent autoimmunity. And I was struggling to eat most of the things that I ate as a vegetarian. I started to have allergic reactions to seemingly innocuous things and other kind of intolerable responses to different foods. And I realized I could no longer accept food when it was offered. And it took me a really long time to figure out what I could eat. And it became really difficult to be a vegetarian. I really shocked myself by starting to eat fish, and then a year later, meat. I have never felt wholly good about eating animals. I knew I was eating sentient beings, but I also felt a huge improvement in my health. As I anticipated coming here, I thought a lot about supermarket violence and also about this, that I was no longer vegetarian. There is something particular about having worked in restaurants and food service that you start to recognize people who are employed in the grocery store or food setting as having like a certain kind of experience there. Also, crucially, the sun and the water move, but food is moved, which contributes significantly to climate change. So there's all kinds of different ways to think about violence in the supermarket. Of course, meat is like a main one. But I thought I would take the opportunity to be a vegetarian while here, but also to think about how I want to eat moving forward and to potentially move back into that. I immediately felt emotionally lighter and so much better, totally different. But eggs are still something I'm wondering about, which is funny because I've been making work about that for the last few months. They're not permitted here on the campus, which is why the work I made over here, which has some images of it, well, not images, but like some sort of images of eggs, was made, it was produced without using any real eggs. But they might be something that I do continue to eat. I'm not sure. And so it's something I want to think through in my work. There's a lot of suffering and potential that seems to be represented there, but it's also something that I feel kind of conflicted around. So I was making this installation. Well, this is a version of it. I was working on a video installation, which I'll show a little bit from. And went into the kitchen at RISD in the dining program where I go to school and cracked 1,600 eggs. Was considerably more than that, but that's how many I ended up with the shells from. I was able to insert myself into the process, which allowed me to think more about eggs as individuals and as wholes. Their shells were especially thin due to the bird flu epidemics that are happening right now in the US. Older chickens with more immunity survive, while younger ones do not. The egg white was getting stuck to my arms and gave me hives, and my body, which is now different because of the autoimmune conditions, even sitting, was having a really hard time with the labor in the kitchen, even though I used to work 16-hour shifts as a prep cook in a restaurant. The labor was much more intense, and the idea of the eggs was at some moments repulsive, and at others, their shells were the most precious and beautiful things in the world. I still have a huge collection of eggshells. We'll see what happens with that. But as I continued to think about eggs, I was thinking about their opacity and surface, but also about life and death as this ultimate threshold of non-consent. And asking myself repeatedly, how do you submit to something that you are already inside of? This is an egg that I'll talk about in a second. Basically, some of the other, things I was thinking about were, where do you locate the body of the egg? Something else that came up was this idea of compassionate witness. The biopolitical is where the touch of language and image is most felt and most visible. I also think it's where pain is usually elicited. So in interacting with these supermarket eggs, I was wondering if I was witnessing their pain. I started to think more about this egg, which was soaking in vinegar, and the vinegar slowly dissolves the calcium in its shell. This other video is of a mouse that I made eye contact with in my studio. So the studio building is filled with mouse traps, and I keep kind of thinking about ways to subvert them and what to do about that. But this mouse and I think maybe had a moment, or maybe not. It's really hard to say. But I was thinking a lot about this idea that the egg could be touched by the mouse's eyes from inside of the eyes of the viewer, that the body of the viewer could become a site where something is being both done and undone at the same time. This is one of the places where the materiality of what is happening really matters to me. There are so many places where words and laws become power structures that become physical and end up killing people and transforming the actual functionality in terms of their existence. We're seeing that for sure in a lot of what's happening right now in the world. There are moments when seeking a diagnosis or language changes the actual functionality and limits of the body. And then there's this moment between the denuded egg and the mouse that I think is kind of like the cheese coupon. And I hope that it can alter something simply through the act of physically watching. And then this was also kind of part of this egg installation thing that I was working on.
We make each other.
This is my last food slide. See if, oh, I hope this video will play. This video is quite good. I mean, maybe it won't. Or is it playing? No. Yes, it is. Okay. So this was one of the first things that I did when I came here to make this work. I didn't know I was going to make this work, but this was the work I was going to make. I started trying to extract grape DNA, which is a process I didn't know that much about. It's really quite simple, but it was largely unsuccessful because I think I got too much of the actual pulp in the DNA, and so I ended up with this kind of mixture of grape DNA, and also wasn't able to like fully clarify it. But I think that in the next few months I will be able to make a clear thread out of it that will have enough strength to functionally replace monofilament in a work that would be similar to this one. The process, despite not producing the desired result, allowed me to interact with the grape and experience it in a lot of different ways, and reminded me that it is not about a material or scientific result necessarily, but about engagement with the grape, or engagement with the material. The grape that is in the installation and is painted with the antibacterial ointment is fulfilling the function that the grape DNA would have for me, just as much, if not more so. But also, I think the thing about art that I love the most is how long the process is, and how frustrating it is, and how many failures are involved. I think that's really the pleasure of making art. So we're going to move on to this next section. We're thinking about the other. This is a phrase that is painted in gold on the studio wall in Providence, where I have my studio. When you stand on one side of the studio, the light blurs the text, and then when you stand on the other, the same thing happens. So it's only possible to read half of the statement at a time. I think this is something I don't want to talk too much about, but I just want to be something that you're conscious of thinking through in this section. This is a piece that I think is maybe the most important piece that I've made up to this point. And when I say important, I don't mean like the piece itself is the most important, but it was the most important for me to have made. It's called Death Mirror, and it's about the relationship between painting and death, and how the materiality of painting can prepare us for death. I'm going to read you a little bit about it and then show you some of it. The mirror is a trick, but then the light is also still real. This piece is a text and Venn diagram animation that's projected onto a thin mirror in the corner of a room. This body of work emerged out of the impulse to seek out an entirely material ghost. Light became both a literal ghost and a metaphor for thinking about a ghost that does not retain subjecthood or identity, but is in some material way the result of or an energetic remainder of a body and subjective entity that was once alive but is now dead. You cannot see death, and I don't think you can really see life, but looking at the material of both or its body, you see something. I watched someone I loved die, and the change felt so much like this. I remember feeling relieved that I could hold her body without disrupting her ability to breathe. The anxiety that is desire or a thirst for life was replaced by an acceptance. It's happening inside the body from one vantage point, but in an external way, the shift also feels very literal. I think for her there was a lot of fear involved, but I don't know. Something clearly did change, but equally as strange was how much it seemed still seemed to remain. It flattens like painting, like an utterance, like looking into a mirror, but the original object is gone. It's especially strange for the observer, not for the person who both is and isn't that body. The surplus is always there, this inability to fully sense or understand or drink anything up, but feeling that more acutely in the process of death and in the process of painting, it creates a gestalt, or the most liminal or peripheral ghost of what remains inaccessible. I've been using these moving images and videos to think about painting, and language in a way that allows these really untouchable parts of painting to continue to guide the work while retaining their mystery. I think that's really important to me, is that I don't want to resolve something because I don't think anything can be resolved. This work is also thinking about what death looks like when we move beyond the anthropocentric and anthropomorphic and into the material. If we can flatten our ontology and see the limits of all forms of access, death takes its place as one such form, but ceases to hold the singular status that it may have previously carried. But the writing in this work is paradoxically deeply effective, specific, and personal. Language is something we are already inside of, and also the materiality of death. We do not need to be alive to appreciate this. We do not have to appreciate it at all. Death and its opening allows for something solidly real and creates the conditions for the possibility for language. So we'll show this excerpt.
The tooth of light puncturing sleep into openness. A mirror makes a new corner where there wasn't one before, and maybe with enough of these corners we might feel that a second room has appeared, not been made per se but discovered in the pre-existing room. Sponging the sound out of my ears. Magnetic dryness of waking at night. In the rinsed light, the mirror room which wetly forms around all silently refracted blue and yellowed light. Half submerged and reflecting yourself only in elbows. Walking into the mirror room. Maybe in a week like this feeling of a dark water place hovering in an ordinary small apartment. Maybe even one that smells like cat piss. It might increase. Between one airless empty mirror and another. And I am left holding the mirror light egg of your what was livingness. And you are an elbow, I see bend and disappear. But taking in the bloodless light in the mirror room, I see that maybe some continuity is still alive inside me, inside that room. Still untouchably deep, and likely holed up somewhere unfindable, unrepeated, singularly not touched. It's soaked in hot tea and remembering something so seamlessly so as to be purely experiencing it. And the completeness I feel is deadly still. As an awareness that has only just slid out of total wetness. My mom keeps telling me that she thinks dying is as easy as moving from one room to another. Or at least she was told it would be. Nothing can always emerge. And I become more diaphanous. And you, who are less and less here, can become more and more separate. What is a distance without 2 points? Like an appearance. But only as an image behind a mirror. The ghost held between us, once moving now holding very impenetrably still. This lighter than lightness relieved of its nothing. Is even less and becoming more and more unburdened. Or it silently leaks out slowly, a clear dark puddle left with something soaking. A glove pulled from a hand. Filled with the internal pressure of what doesn't disappear when emptied. As a distance that arrived empty. As a body is a mirror. Or a body is the only surface to see death, and when it arrives.
Okay. Okay, so this project is actually, sorry. 1 second here. This project is actually something that started with Hassan. It's actually a project that he was doing. He had asked me to write an introduction for something that he was working on, which was called Everything Belongs to God. And I wrote an introduction, but then we started making images together, which I think was maybe the more interesting part of the project for me. And I realized while I was doing this project with him that a few different things. One thing I realized was something about the significance of directing these works at single individuals, that I'm not only trying to implicate them in their image, but I'm also interested in taking this individuation to its logical conclusion and opening that category, the category of what it means to be a named single individual or a named thing. I also think this was significant as an experience because it allowed me to start thinking about language more as an image. I had already been thinking about that, but I had this experience with the text written in hair and also with text made from grass that I realized introduces at least a little bit of hesitation into the process of reading. And this can't be permanently extended, but it's something I kind of wish you could extend longer. And so that's something I'm still thinking about, and I really appreciated doing this with him. It's definitely was another really significant experience for me. That project, I'm kind of working on some parts of it on my own now, thinking about arrows a lot. And the arrow is something that is pointing outside of the image, but what it's pointing to, I don't really know. And that's kind of, I had made this project, which was also reflecting on that, where the arrows were dictating where the images go, trying to point outside of this idea of God a little bit. Okay, so we're at the last section. Thank you for making it this far with me. I'm sorry, this is kind of long. But think about language. As soon as I arrived here, I immediately noticed all the places where the shadows of the buildings and the trees touch the sunlight. UV light is one of the biggest triggers of autoimmune response for me. So noticing this is in some ways a matter of survival. But I also realized immediately that this was the space that I wanted to work in. Between the sunlight and the shadow of the buildings, this is where I wanted to contemplate the non-dual nature of things, which tells you how truly far away I am from enlightenment and my understanding of non-duality that I would pick this situation. But for me, it is representative of the way that I am able to find to move forward in my practice. I continue to move to these somewhat frictious points, or where I know I misunderstand something, because that's the only way I can detach from these points of attachment, or to understand through a material engagement and a process of passing through. This is the image of the fountain that I was able to get from the other side of the shadow in that other image. I couldn't get close to the fountain even though I really wanted to. So anyway, I started working on this UV resin at this edge, and that's where all of the work that is over there came from. It was all cured entirely in the sunlight. This residency has been a really good opportunity for me to come to a place where my greatest fears are visible and happening, both COVID-19 and also extreme heat. And as soon as we got here, there was an outbreak of COVID going on, and immediately it was like 110 degrees, I don't know, something completely crazy. But DRBU also, I think, represents the perfect opportunity to engage with things in this way, or it does for me. Because it's an institution, a university, that offers this space for contemplation and is a community of people who are engaged not only with text, but also with embodiment and practice. But there are also many contradictions in this kind of organization, adjacent to a monastic community, but still separate. And also in using language to talk about something that seeks to untie language and to open the illusory nature of language and image, and really all of the bodily senses up. So I keep wondering if language has this potential to help with detachment, or if it is only, which I think, there's a limit to that, but I do think that maybe it could have a function, and I think that art materially can have that function, but I'm not sure. As I said before, I've kept Buddhism at an arm's length despite being interested in it now for more than half of my life. I think I've always had this idea that I was not ready, but ultimately I also feel like this is a dualistic way of looking at it. I think Buddhism, like art, is something that we are always already inside of all the time. There is no outside. This may not always be perceptible, but I also wonder how significant or possible perceiving this is. Can your body accept or reject something without you, or is this a totally active process? I'm really not sure. I was reading this, I know this was quoted also in your reader. While I was here, I've been reading a lot of sutras and definitely don't have a good understanding of them, but this couple things here really struck me. The sutra text itself, this all conditioned phenomena are like dreams, illusions, bubbles, shadows, like dewdrops and a lightning flash. Contemplate them thus is just so great. But Master Hua writes here under shadows that shadows follow people around. When there is a form, then there is a shadow. The form is an actual substance, the shadow is empty. If explained in more depth, even form itself is empty and totally unreal. If you do not believe that, then just continue to be attached to your body, protect it and maintain it, and see whether or not it dies. I really, really loved that. I thought that was perfect. And then I also really loved this part where he writes in the, this is also same page, let's see, he writes, I have no fear. I have never been afraid of anything from the moment I was born. Dead men, living men, strange essences, or weird creatures, tigers, lions, I fear none of them. Bring me a tiger and it will turn into a kitten. Try it out. I can be this way because I have no obstructions. With me, everything is okay. If everything is like dewdrops and a lightning flash, like dreams, illusions, bubbles, or shadows, then what can obstruct? There is no obstruction, and so there is no fear. The Heart Sutra says, when there are no impediments, there is no fear. With no fear, upside-down dreamlike thoughts are left far behind. Therefore, I say, I do not fear tigers. If you do not believe me, bring a tiger, and I will sit in meditation beside it. I really appreciated this. There were a lot of different sutra texts I wanted to pull up. I also thought about talking to you about the scripture on the explication of underlying meaning, which is excellent for talking about images, but this was the thing that I felt like was the most important to talk about. I was thinking a lot about where this value of naming a thing ends, because obviously it can go on endlessly and become a trap. But I was also thinking a lot about whether or not you can practice at this limit, and inside of this like fearless space that he's talking about, and how long you can do that, and if that's something that I can do without making myself sick. I was thinking about both in the physical body, but also thinking about this in terms of compassion and capacity. I know I'm don't have that capacity right now, but I think that thinking about images is the most helpful thing I can think of to help me understand this. I think images try to convince us of outside realities, but they still have consequences and realities of their own. For me, still, there's no outside of survival right now, and probably in some ways no outside of fear either. Birth, death, and maybe enlightenment could change these conditions, yet I still feel like I have access to something through my survival. How can survival bring you closer to having an aesthetic experience? I think this happens all the time for people, and likely all other beings. I think it probably happens also for objects like rocks and clear water glasses. For some people, art seems like another layer, maybe higher up on the hierarchy of their needs, but instead I wonder if it can be total. I think that because it's a lens that continues to, not really something that I've chosen necessarily, but something that consistently chooses me, it can be, at least for me. I was thinking about this early on, very hot, having a really hard time with the heat, and trying to meditate, and how helpful that was, but also thinking that I wouldn't have come to the point where I was even ready to attempt meditating had I not been so hot. So I feel like sometimes that's the thing that really helps me the most, are these kind of conditions of discomfort. So this is something that I started thinking about more. I would lay in my room until I felt the blood was coming back into my head when it was really hot. And one night I didn't want to go out, but I had no water to take my pills with in the morning. And everything here is a little bit more spread out. So survival-based tasks take place in specific places, eating, water, all those things you have to kind of move between buildings to get to. And my attachment to objects also meant that I was carrying a lot of things between buildings because I can't not. But that night it was very hot. I put on my ice vest, which is what I'm wearing now, and went across the courtyard to fill up my bottle on the way back. And I was wholly caught up in the light of the fountain at night, which was another moment where some duality between the light and the dark presented this opportunity to meditate on the non-dual nature of reality, on how categories, while sometimes useful, do not capture or adhere to reality. In the class that I taught this week, some students felt that art involved a kind of capture or a taking of a picture, holding something sculptural in your hands, but others did not. And I don't know what's most useful in terms of like language between people here, but for me this idea of capture is really funny, because we can never fully hold or exhaust the material, the aesthetic experience. Those things are inexhaustible and happen entirely outside of any economy. When I say there is no outside to survival or art, I do not mean that we are caught inside of this practice of capture. Instead, what I mean is that it is always available to us, these experiences of non-capture, non-dual, and specificity. Plasticity is transformable, but with these sticky points. It is not really a matter of capture or not, but of where you enter the process. How can being aware of our survival allow us to soften and see this? The paradox for me is that it is through the materiality of the world that I feel closer to untying the attachment. I do not know or understand the sutras, even though I love them. I have experience reading them, something which can involve some contact with them, or maybe involves them withdrawing from me, I don't know. But I'm left again and again with just an image. And I have something kind of paraphrased from Catherine Malibu, where she says, being could care less about power, and yet there is no outside of either. And I also have something about causality. I'm coming to the end here, but I wanted to read this Timothy Morton quote real quick. And then I have something else to read. But Timothy Morton writes in Realist Magic, he's an object-oriented ontology person, I argue that causality is wholly an aesthetic phenomenon. Aesthetic events are not limited to interactions between humans, or between humans and painted canvases, or between humans and sentences and dramas. They happen when a saw bites into a fresh piece of plywood. They happen when a worm oozes out of some wet soil. They happen when a massive object emits gravity waves. When you make or study art, you are not exploring some kind of candy on the surface of the machine. You are making or studying causality. The aesthetic dimension is the causal dimension. It still astonishes me to write this, and I wonder whether you will cease to be astonished or not. I'm still thinking about these kind of remainders or images, which are this kind of reality. When he talks about how it's not a candy on the surface of things, I think that's really what I relate to in that quote. My practice has moved into sculpture using images rather than video, painting, or photography, because I'm much more concerned about the consequences than what it looks like. And there's a lot of evidence of that in this piece that I made right here. But there's also kind of a deeper logic, one in which the image of Catherine Malibu, Silvio, or God is a determining factor, something that has real consequences inside of the work. The work is seeking to draw these things out or make them more visible, but it does not create them. They are and were already always happening. This moment of biopolitics for me is where language or image creates suffering. It's really an attempt for language to make itself more material and to instantiate more. And I have a lot of empathy for that, I think. which is kind of a weird thing to say, but I wonder if we can help it realize that it's already instantiating enough and real enough if that changes the terms of engagement. These clear things are not a metaphor for me. They're another way to experience this non-capture feeling. It's a way of thinking about the clarity of seeing through and into a middle space inside the threshold. There's no outside of language or image for me, but there might be a thread that can be pulled or a clear space to occupy in the center. And I'm going to go ahead and read a short text over some of these videos, and that's how I'll conclude that I wrote while I was here. There is no outside. Language has an ambivalent relationship with me, which means sometimes the door is shut, sometimes it is thrown open, and sometimes the door of language is a shape I only know because I occupy the empty space into which it would be fitted. Body consciousness of language. Language holds tight. Language holds tight. I do not want to release you. It does not want to release you. Magnetic, sticky with meaning, form finding its form inside a hole. Language blacks out your eyes and stitches your arms to your side and muffles your ears, and it locks you beneath and momentary or forever leaves you inside, and you wait in the airport of language alone. If it will arrive back and unbind you, wash and lightly touch your closed eyelids from above until they open like sinking your teeth slowly through cheese. And you look into what is nothing more than the large capital L with hands that are not human and are not hands, and ink spurts like cuttlefish, and when you ask a question, there is no mouth to reply. The I consciousness of language, causality. The world is full of objects, and objects are tripwires. Touch one, and you touch them all. Touch none, and you still touch, but do not make contact. Objects recede and tell us who and what they are simultaneously. The world is evasive for language, and yet present. And it is through focus and singular attention that it can be watched rupture and scatter. Language, tongue, consciousness. When we submit, we are saying, you made me, and I know it. We make each other without touching. We make each other without meaning. We make each other without speaking. We make each other in our blindness. The mind consciousness of language. Forms of not being restricted to the capacity to language or to understand or to think. All forms of access are equal in their incompleteness. Being is a window, like a painting that is both closed and open. Its indeterminacy makes it both possible and impossible, imperative to look clearly. We make each other, and yet, when we look at one another, we see either surfaces or pass through into fantasy. The need for other worlds evaporates only ever when we realize we're only ever looking through the endless windows into what glimpse you thought you caught. The pain from looking into what will not yield intensifies the longer you look, and language takes a cotton-gloved finger and presses on just the right spot. A voluntary drowning, a cup full, a cut me first so liveness can appear, a drip me into its sensation. But language is not only one being, but language has only one being, which is outside of all human culture. And when language returns to sit in its cave and watch the world through the dark without eyes, it wants to close itself, to find its own borders, to know its own shape, where its vastness touches the outside. But instead, it only senses that even as it makes itself smaller, what is most interior to it shrinks inside. Language makes rules for itself. It can only touch objects with the backside of its hand 1 week. It can only drink water the next, walking meditation each morning and night for 1 week. The next week it must eat everything it's offered, no spitting out into a napkin, swallowing only. Then it decides it cannot fantasize about becoming a monastic anymore because it recognizes something that it cannot quite give up. It must conform to an institutional rhythm, and then later it must fall out into its own stricter timetable. The one rule that it keeps trying to follow but can't is a restriction that tells it to stop offering up difference, to discontinue its meaning-making scheme. Language ear consciousness. And exhausting itself, language lays listening for some sign of itself, a mere image of its own stretched forms, wondering if what it is giving up, if what is left to give up is the very idea of its own threshold, an alienation that is as conditioned and fleeting and as laden with as much motivation to grasp, as transformable. Something curled into the well of language's own ear, waiting to enter, but not needing to be let in. And thank you so much for your patience. That was very long. I appreciate it, but that's the end of my talk.